All right, so what are we going to do with this big old book that you are reading as probably, most likely, not as a book, but as the fluid pages in an electronic book, which might make it even harder than it is to read it this way. So let's think about how technology is and is not working for you. And I hope that reading the ebook can be a good experience for you. And so what do we make about why on a field course of Heart Mountain as an icon of American landscape have we got you reading political philosophy that has a real moral philosophy component to it? What does that have to do with developing the skills for looking clearly and well at American landscape? I want you to return in your mind to our thinkings about Charles Long's encyclopedia entry on religious interpretations of America, and think about what Mary Louise Pratt says, how she describes in her book Imperial Eyes. She describes a contact zone, quote, as a space of colonial encounters, the space which peoples geographically and historically separated come into contact with each other and establish ongoing relations, usually involving conditions of coercion, radical inequality, and intractable conflict. And so clearly we can just launch and say, yep, that'd be Heart Mountain. We can acknowledge that this is a place where people who had geographically and historically been separated, they came into contact with each other. They established ongoing relations, first trappers, traders, and we've read in our Pretty Shield and Plenty Coup descriptions of the earliest encounters, and then that moves into escalations of encounter, ultimately treaty relationships, from trading and marriage and hunting and fighting into treaty relationships. And those treaties presented as the meeting of two nations and treated in American law as a treaty between nations. But really, the best way to understand the outcome of those treaties was that they were developed under conditions of coercion, that the beneficiaries of those treaties are marked by the radical inequality of who benefited, and that there was intractable conflict that resulted in Indian wars, that resulted in reductions to very small treated lands. So now here we go with this is therefore a contact situation represents ethical and moral dilemmas for those involved. And this is the man who takes American history writ large in the same way that Long did. He takes American history writ large and even places that into the global context. He can move through South Africa, the post-apartheid era, and he begins even with some St. Paul and thinking about that moment of time in between the resurrection of the Savior and the coming again of the Messiah as a time of ethic. How do you live in such a time where the arrival of judgment has not, and justice has not yet happened? So Meister is a monster. He is an intellectual monster who can move. You just feel him striding through waters, deep waters, as he goes. And he has pulled together what he thinks are the most compelling landscapes, backdrops, with which to consider the moral dilemmas of America, given its contact zones. And also, Meister goes into something we don't touch in this course, that entire heritage of African American participation. Now, I'm going to put you away now, Mr. Long. So a few key terms, just to be able to get into this. We have realpolitik. The graph here shows the use of the word realpolitik over time. And as you know, Meister is presenting us with an analysis that the 20th century is looked at as a time of evil, in that genocide happened and that humans were able to harness technology to produce greater amounts of suffering and death than had ever been humanly possible before. So, realpolitik is a term that comes out of this same century. And originally, it was a German political philosopher. It didn't have a negative connotation. It just said, let's get pragmatic. If it comes to feeding the people, we are going to worry about that first, versus worrying about whether or not the place we're getting the food from is a good neighbor or is good to its people. So realpolitik just pulls in that pragmatic, practical edge. Another term from our reading that might have been odd to you was fin de siècle. So it's a French term meaning the spirit of a culture at the end of a century. Humans tend to think that a big new number, 1800, 1900, 2000, signals a big transition. So it's not just arbitrarily another movement of the sun. Something about the numbers kind of creates this benchmark. And so we build up to it, we cross that threshold. And now if you think about the discussion of what is religion, when religion is an orientation, then you can see that even time and a calendar creates this threshold against which people are asking questions of meaning. What does it mean as I come up to 2000? Will there be some cataclysmic event? Will the Y2K virus shut down all the computers in the world? Is God coming? We see both in religious communities and in political communities that the fin de siècle, that having a look back at the past 100 years, creates great moments for the communities to generate and narrate a story about the meaning. Was the meaning of that past 100 years a good one? Was it a negative one? For Meister, his argument is that the fin de siècle of the 20th century, the feeling of that time is that they're looking back and being haunted by the evil of genocide that happens, and they're looking forward to a time when such genocide would be overcome by a universal agreement to protect any whose human rights were grossly impacted. So that we want to be over Auschwitz. We want to be able to say never again. And that the 20th century was going to usher us into a time when governments would not stand by for genocides. A few key dates from our introduction. 1789, the French Revolution, overthrow of monarchy for liberty, equality, fraternity. Thomas Paine wrote The Rights of Man in 1791 to argue in support of the French Revolution, that that is one of the thresholds to which Meister refers, because the spirit of the French Revolution was to take down, was revolutionary, take down and redistribute the wealth and property of the monarchy to make a more just society for the little people. who should all experience liberty, equality, and fraternity. 1989, we have the fall of communism. So there's a 200-year window that are important for Meister's thinking. 1989, the fall of communism. So the end of the Cold War means the end of the Cold War divisions of global strategies, whereby Central America, Korea, those were places that the Soviet Union and the U.S. had like a checkerboard sense of the globe, which were going to be communist, which were going to be democracies and capitalist. When communism falls, it represents in Meister's presentation here, the ethos of the fin de siècle. So no longer is revolution and counter-revolution, because communism marked a revolution that was going to redistribute, whether it was czars or kings or queens, redistribute the wealth of the ruling class and create a democratic, I shouldn't use that word, should I? Create a socialist state whereby the good of all is what was going to matter. And we could go into socialism and democracy and all kinds of things. I won't do that here right now. So no longer, for Meister, the point is no longer is revolution and counter-revolution the goal of political change. Rather, after the fall of communism, the national governments shift to a defensive and protective stance against cruelty to humans. It's no longer about whether you'll be communist or democratic capitalist. The 21st century was ushered in with an international language of human rights. Having experienced Auschwitz and the genocide in Rwanda, nation states now have an obligation to prevent harm. This is a shift from the Cold War discourses of promoting democracy. And then the other important date for him is 9/11, which initiated for the first time the linking of a pursuit of human rights in the language of a war on terror. So what an interesting, from the French Revolution to 9/11, what an interesting context in which Meister wants to think about after evil. So now we're going to go to this third key term, temporality, in the next video, and think about why in the world he called the book After Evil, and what does temporality have to do with his moral philosophy.